In 2008, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad went to vacation in Turkey with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This visit was quite unusual because if you watch the previous video, which explains the history of the conflict between Turkey and Syria and how they almost went to war twice, you would know that the mere visit of a Syrian president to Turkey would be a really big deal, let alone a vacation. Clearly, something needs explanation. To understand why, we need to look not at Damascus nor at Ankara, but at Baghdad, and go back to 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. The American presence in Iraq increased tensions in Damascus because the presidential administration of George W. Bush criticized the policies of the Syrian leadership and its relations with Hezbollah and Lebanon and several other Palestinian groups. Bashar's problem wasn't these criticisms, but rather that the Americans were now on Syria's border. They had toppled Saddam, and they could do the same thing to Bashar. This pushed him to strengthen his relations with neighboring countries in the region such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. The government in Turkey was not pleased with the American decision to invade Iraq, even though it was a US ally in NATO. Turkey had different objectives, because as we said in the previous video, which you'll find in the description and the comments, the fall of the Soviet Union gave Turkey a major opportunity to replace Russian influence in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. The goal of the Turkish government was to build friendly relations with all countries in its surrounding regions, including Syria. During Erdogan's visit to Damascus in 2004, a major turning point in Turco-Syrian relations, he said, "Can you distinguish between a Syrian and a Turk among these enlightened faces in this hall? I want to call you my brothers, not my friends." Regarding the issue of Iraq, both sides were uneasy about the American invasion. Particularly, they were worried about the collapse of the Iraqi state and the establishment of a Kurdish state in Iraqi Kurdistan, especially since both were directly facing the Iraqi theater. The question of the Kurds will be important to us a bit later. In any case, with their aligned interests and principles, Bashar made the first visit by a Syrian president to Turkey since 1946, after Erdogan had gone to Damascus. The two strengthened their military cooperation and held joint consultations regarding Iraq. And from here, the governments in Damascus and Ankara grew closer, perhaps for the first time in history. Erdogan and Bashar were on good terms. Bashar went to the coastal Turkish city of Bodrum to vacation with Erdogan. And in the same year, Turkey and Syria abolished visa requirements between each other and also eliminated taxes on transport trucks crossing the border. A high-level strategic cooperation council was also established between the two countries, which Syrian foreign minister at the time, Walid al-Muallim, called the greatest evidence of cooperation, solidarity, and mutual trust. In response, the Turkish foreign minister said that it elevated the brotherhood between the two countries to the political level. The governments in Ankara and Damascus were friends, along with their leaders. Their strategic interests were aligned, and life was simple. Until everything changed. In 2011, Erdogan said that Bashar should learn from Gaddafi and resign. Wait, what happened? In early 2011, Erdogan's relationship with Bashar was still good, but Bashar's relationship with a large segment of the Syrian population was not. When protests erupted against the Syrian government, many countries condemned Bashar's actions, and Erdogan sent his foreign minister at the time, Ahmet Davutoğlu, to Damascus to deliver two messages to Bashar. The first, stop the loss of life. The second, meet the demands for democratic reform. Davutoğlu described the actions of the Syrian government forces as, quote, unacceptable, and said he discussed with Assad ways to prevent confrontation between government forces and demonstrators. But little did he know, this was the last visit by a high-ranking Turkish official during Bashar's rule. And even before that visit, Erdogan had said regarding the situation in Syria that his patience was running out. With the escalation of events in Syria into a civil war, the government in Ankara cut ties with the government in Damascus and recognized the Syrian opposition as the legitimate representative of Syria. From here, the relationship between Bashar and Erdogan declined sharply. There were expectations that Bashar, like Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and Mubarak, would fall, especially after the civil war broke out, which left the Syrian government forces in a relatively difficult position. Turkish leadership sided with the opposition, and Erdogan criticized Bashar heavily. If we assume that Turkey's goal in supporting the Syrian opposition was to remove Bashar, then the Turks forgot something important. Bashar was not alone. Russian President Vladimir Putin repeatedly condemned the protests against the Syrian government and strongly supported Assad. Analysts say that Putin wanted to preserve the Russian military naval base in the Syrian coastal city of Tartus, as it gives Russia the ability to exert influence over North Africa and southern Europe. In addition to Russia, Iran and its Shia allies supported Bashar, who himself was Shia. The support of these two parties for Bashar prevented his fall. But despite that, opposition forces still controlled large parts of northern Syria. But despite that, Turkey was unable to intervene without sparking a war with Russia or Iran, which would have been costly, especially since the Obama administration was not ready to intervene in Syria just yet. Turkey was able to help the opposition though, and they still had the advantage on the ground. But this would be significantly reduced due to another player entering the Syrian theater. When ISIS entered Syria and took control of areas in the country, the Syrian opposition lost many advantages, and thus Turkey's position in Syria was weakened. For Turkey, the entry of ISIS itself was a dangerous development, especially when it reached the Turkish border and carried out terrorist operations in the country. But ISIS was not the only adversary to Turkey. The retreat of the Syrian opposition gave the Democratic Union Party, or PYD, the main Syrian Kurdish party, a better position in the northern regions along the Turkish border. The government in Ankara considers this party a terrorist organization due to its links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. And as we saw in the previous video, which you'll find in the comments and the description, Turkey almost went to war with Syria over its accusations that the PKK had refuge in the country. And now, the same story could happen again. It wasn't just that. We forgot to mention the American position. The United States supported the Syrian opposition to Bashar, but after the opposition was weakened with the rise of ISIS, the Americans focused on supporting the Kurds because their position was stronger in fighting ISIS. This, of course, did not make the government in Ankara happy. In addition to those challenges, we need to recognize that the Syrian opposition was not the only one to suffer from the rise of ISIS, because Syrian government forces under Bashar al-Assad were also put under heavy pressure, which led to a direct Russian military intervention in Syria to fight terrorism and preserve the Syrian government. The presence of the Russian military on Turkey's southern border was important because it made the fall of Bashar's regime unlikely and reinforced Russia's willingness to defend its strategic interests in Syria. And the same applied to Iran, who, along with its Shia allies, also increased its presence in Syria. During this stage, Turkey maintained its relations with the opposition while at the same time shifting its focus from toppling Bashar to confronting the Kurds and terrorism along its immediate border with Syria. Turkey was operating in an extremely complex geopolitical situation. Erdogan wanted to continue a neutral policy, working with all of his neighbors without problems, and focusing on shared interests, like he did with Russia, Iran, and the United States. But at the same time, he did not like Bashar and opposed the Kurdish groups, and perhaps to better execute this complex policy, he launched Turkish military operations in Syria. As we said in the previous video, Turkey had mobilized its troops on its border with Syria twice, but this time it was for real. And it was in August 2016 when Turkish troops crossed the Syrian border and took control of the area around the city of Jarablus. The Turks said after the operation, which was called Operation Euphrates Shield, that after expelling ISIS from the area, Turkey expected American help in fighting Kurdish groups west of the Euphrates River. West of the Euphrates, the Syrian government controlled Aleppo, the largest city in Syria, after a fierce battle. At this stage, Turkey focused on the Kurdish groups, perhaps because Russia and Iran's resistance to Bashar led to him solidifying his power over Syria and made it more difficult for Turkey to remove Bashar. That didn't mean Turkey liked Bashar, but it did mean that it was willing to enter negotiations with Iran and Russia to coordinate in Syria. And they did, and established 3 de-escalation zones in eastern Ghouta, Homs, Daraa, and Idlib. And although fighting continued due to the conflicting interests of the 3 parties, there was coordination among them. The Syrian government by this point had made important gains backed by Russia, and the Russian role was very important because it meant that Turkey couldn't get involved in Syria without coordinating with Russia or dealing with a Russian response. Putin, for his part, despite Erdogan's opposition to Assad, was willing to work with the Turkish president. We need to remember that Turkey is a US and NATO ally in a very strategic portion of the world, and if Putin could isolate Turkey from the rest of its NATO allies, then Russia would benefit greatly. And perhaps for this reason, Putin opposed antagonizing Turkey to a large degree. Erdogan, for his part, had a number of political differences with the Europeans and Americans, and maybe to maintain strategic neutrality, he also avoided antagonizing Putin too greatly. This was seen in 2018, when Turkey launched a second intervention in the area around Afrin, but only after coordinating with Russia and the withdrawal of Russian military personnel from the region prior to the fighting. The same happened in 2019. Following Turkey's intervention, Erdogan went to the Russian coastal city of Sochi and consulted with Putin. The point is that Russia played a very large role in Turkey's southern flank. And the same applied to Iran, who Erdogan was open to, likely to maintain a level of strategic neutrality, as he did with Russia. By early 2020, Bashar controlled most of the country again, except for the Kurdish regions, the areas occupied by Turkey, and two remaining opposition enclaves, one of them in Idlib. In February that year, Syrian forces tried to retake the city again, but Turkey responded and sent its army to resist it, halting the advance of government forces. Putin, watching what was happening, agreed with Erdogan in Moscow on a ceasefire, roughly a week after. The Battle of Idlib in 2020 was the last major battle between Turkey and Syria during the war, and the idea of a rapprochement between the two was brought up. In 2022, Erdogan said he might meet with Bashar when the time is right. But Bashar said he did not want to meet Erdogan until Turkey withdrew from northern Syria. He also added in August 2024 that attempts to restore relations with Turkey had yielded no results. In any case, Bashar wasn't going to stay for much longer. The opposition in Idlib launched a new campaign against Assad's government, leading to its collapse after 13 years of protests and war. And the role that Turkey is playing in supporting the new Syrian government is something we will see next week. And we'll see what Turkey's new security situation is, what the role of Russia is, and what the role of another party who has launched attacks on the new Syrian government has also been. Don't forget to watch the previous video, which explains how Turkey and Syria almost went to war twice. Thank you for watching.